everybody, welcome back to English Champion. On this episode, I want to give you a little bit of insight into what my childhood was like from a reading standpoint. I read a lot online about how all kids really, but especially boys today, just really don't read. They have no interest in books, and literacy rates are dropping, scores are dropping, and boys are kind of at the worst end of it. And so I've just been thinking about that a lot. And one of the reasons I got into teaching as a male was to help all kids, of course, but to especially help young boys take more of an interest in academics and especially in reading, because I was a big reader. And I often would teach my young kids when I taught elementary school many years ago, but then all the way up when I was, teaching college students, all the way, 22-year-olds, I would teach them the same thing, that, you can be more than one thing, and you can have a variety of interests. And when I was a kid, I was very, very much into sports, as I'll explain here in a second. But again, I also liked reading and writing, and I liked math for a long time. And you can be multiple things. The trick for teachers and parents is to try to find things that kids will be interested in. And for me, it was pretty easy because I was always interested in these things. And so I just took very naturally to it. My parents are both readers, and so I always had books around the house. My parents were always reading. My mom taught me to read at a very, very young age. Well before I ever went to kindergarten, I was already a fluent reader. And so it came very easily to me, but it's a combination of the ease of the skill with also some of the content. And as I'm going to show you here, the books that I have, that I still have 40 years later, are very male centric. And that's a complaint that I hear a lot about or read online, is people talking about, what are some good books for kids? I can't find anything. And you see a lot of recommendations are kind of these adventure stories, a lot of fantasy stuff, some classic. There's kind of a wide variety, but I wasn't interested in any of that stuff. And so I'm going to show you some of the things I was interested in. And I know it's going to be a bit dated because I was an elementary school student in the 1980s, 40 years ago. But the stories that I still have in my bin in my garage, are still really good stories, and I would recommend them to any kid today. And so my whole house, as you see, is surrounded by books. As a literature professor, I have just books everywhere in 2 different offices and in bins elsewhere around the house. So I dug into my personal stash, and I want to just show you, parents or teachers, some of the things that are available for kids, especially for boys. And so let's dive in here. When I was young and still today, I was always into sports. I started playing, Little League at 5 and soccer at 5 and Pee Wee full pad tackle football at, 7. I mean, whatever it was. And then eventually got into basketball. So I was always playing sports. And not only did I like to play, but I liked to read about sports. And so I would constantly go to the library at my elementary school. And I must have read every single book on sports that my elementary school had. And then my parents would take me to the public library and I'd get books from there. And then for birthdays or Christmases, I'd get books. In my house, we didn't have enough money to have video games. Those were way too expensive for my household. So, I got a few toys here and there sometimes, but I always, I usually got a football. Every several years I might get a new baseball mitt after I'd worn my other one out. It was always athletic stuff, and then it was books. So those were always my presents from my parents or my grandparents. And so I've kept them all these years. And so let me just show a few to you. For some reason, I was very enamored by nonfiction, and I have some fiction books I'll show you as well. But I don't know why. I've always liked biographies and like books with statistics in them. So at my elementary school, where I went from kindergarten through 3rd grade, they had this whole series of these histories of like football teams and baseball teams. And so I would read those histories, and they'd have like season by season the records and the stats for that year of the players, and how they did in the playoffs. And it would be this kind of account of their season from that year or over the history of their club. And I read all of them. So for some reason, I've always kind of liked nonfiction, and so I have this just giant stack of nonfiction stuff. So I was constantly reading like this book I got from my granddad. It's just Pro Football Heroes. It's Johnny Unitas on the cover, and who's even in here? Don Hudson, Sammy Baugh, Jim Brown, Vince Lombardi, like the oldest, best, stories of these old time football guys. And so, I mean, I must have read this book 5 times when I was 6, 7 years old. And these aren't picture books. These are real books with classic photographs in them. And so this is the kind of stuff I would read. Like I lost the cover on this, the complete Super Bowl story. So this is the history of all the Super Bowls from game 1 to 21. So this was, there's been more games since then than there were in this book. But, so like I knew the history of all the football games, all the Super Bowls, and who won and who were the MVPs of those games. By the time I was like 8 years old or whatever, I knew all of that stuff because these are the things I used to read. Same thing with baseball, the World Series, the greatest contests. So this is like which World Series were the most exciting. So I'd read the stories of those. Pro football's all-time all-star team, Joe Montana on the cover. So, again, these player statistics and biographies, same thing. Superstars, basketball's all-time greats, David Thompson on the cover, from the 70s, and actual biographies. So the Johnny Unitas story, big in my household. My dad and granddad were big Johnny Unitas fans. Fran Tarkenton, Hall of Fame quarterback from the 60s and 70s. Baseball, the Bobby Richardson story, from the New York Yankees, who was a very good man and just a great leader on a team that had way more famous people. He played with Mickey Mantle, and yet Bobby Richardson was one of the most important people on that team. And so just these great stories of these figures who accomplished great things, but in many cases were also good people. Eventually, as I got into basketball, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan. And even as an elementary kid, these are from my dad's collection, and I snagged them, and I should probably give them back to him after all these years. But Instant Replay by Jerry Kramer. This is one of the first real like inside looks into professional football, written from a player's perspective. And like, look how tiny this writing is. I mean, this is the stuff I was reading at 8, 9, 10 years old, about a lineman from the Green Bay Packers. And then same thing with Gale Sayers, I Am Third. This book, I actually teach an excerpt of it in my sports and literature class. But again, look at the tiny writing. I did a book report on this biography in 4th grade. I still remember. So like I was reading this stuff at age 9. Why? Because I loved sports. I loved hearing about all these legendary people who did amazing stuff and were just really talented. Pro sports champions, great receivers of the NFL. Like again, all just biographical stuff. Then, of course, like all kids, I liked weird stuff, so I always had a Guinness Book of World Records laying around from that year or something like that. And so sports oddities, like, so it's little snapshots of these guys this one guy a long time ago pitched 2 no-hitters in one afternoon, these weird statistics. This other college player scored 9 touchdowns in one game, so like a combination of sort of weird stories, but also math. When I was even younger, more of a picture book, but like Babe Ruth, Home Run Hero, good pictures in it. And then, of course, the classic Casey at the Bat, picture version of that very famous poem. So, these are things that I read constantly, and I don't know why, other than my dad liked sports, and so we would watch sports a lot, and then he would tell me these stories of these guys, and and like we all do. Well, when I was a kid, this was my favorite player, and I'd say, oh well, tell me about him. Is there a book about him? Let me learn more about him. And so that's how I have all these old guys from the 50s and 60s and 70s that were on my shelves and I was reading about. But it wasn't always just biographies and kind of books on statistics and things like that. I liked fiction too, so I have a whole stack of athlete fiction. So I've got this, again, these are big books. These aren't little tiny kiddie picture books. These are like full size novels. This is called Touchdown Maker, Fast Break Fury. And these are books from the 60s. Even weird stuff like Freddie and the baseball team from Mars. I don't know. I don't even remember what that's about other than it being weird. But then also very realistic stories. This one's called Hang Tough, Paul Mather, about a kid who He actually gets leukemia, and so his team kind of rallies around him to support him. This book was actually a Newbery Award winner, The Moves Make the Man, which is about these two kids who are one black, one white, and they kind of challenge each other on the basketball court and become friends. So just really good, kind of good plots, good stuff for kids to learn about. I got into a few series. It's called Rookie Quarterback, Backboard Battle. These are 130 pages long, so they're not super long, but these aren't picture books. These are normal novels for kids that I just devoured them. And my favorite author, who kind of became a little bit famous in the children's lit world, his name was Matt Christopher, and I had a whole bunch of them, and I've kept a lot of them all the way up to now. For some reason, I still have all these, and so I have this stack of books by Matt Christopher, and a lot of them, again, have really good morals in them. Not like preachy, but just like good life lessons that kids can learn, and things that a lot of kids go through, and so they're very relatable, especially for someone who's playing all these sports as a kid. But even I had friends who, weren't like necessarily playing them officially like I was. I was on these teams as a kid, but I had friends in my class who didn't play in the local little league, or who didn't play for the school football team or whatever, like I always did. And yet they would read them too, just because they were about boys and doing fun stuff. And, they would play at recess. They didn't necessarily take it as seriously as I did, but they were books that they could relate to as well. So this one's called Sink It, Rusty, about a basketball player. And again, similar to the Paul Mather book, he had overcome an illness, and so was kind of getting back into the game after being out for a while. Challenge at second base. Common theme in Matt Christopher books is kids who have these plans for their team, and then they go awry. And so that's one where a kid thinks he's going to be the second baseman on the team this year, but this other kid ends up being really good, and so he has to adjust, and he ends up getting moved to another position and has to learn his new role on the team. And so again, just good life lessons about being a good teammate. The Basket Counts. I think this might have been about race too. I can't remember. Like, again, guys who are different from each other, but getting along and becoming friends even though they're different. Soccer Halfback, Little Lefty. I was a left-handed baseball player, or athlete in all sports. But this is about a baseball kid who's left-handed. Baseball Pals. Catcher with a Glass Arm, about a kid who's a catcher, but he struggles to make that throw to second base, and so he has to practice on improving that skill. The Year Mom Won the Pennant is about a baseball team where they don't have a coach for that year, and so one of the boys' moms ends up being the coach, and she teaches them about how to be a good team, even though they're skeptical, of course, because it's their mom. But again, good book about family and learning from each other. The Kid Who Only Hit Homers, always like that one. Long Stretch at First Base. So I have all these Matt Christopher books, and I think he wrote over 100, but I probably read, I don't know, 30 of them over the years when I was in everywhere from first grade through fifth grade probably. And so he was my favorite author. And I'm so sad because I don't have my favorite book of all of his. I don't know where it is. Somehow I've lost it over the years, but maybe it's back at my parents' house. But I looked everywhere in my house. I couldn't seem to find it. But it's one of his books called Tough to Tackle. And it was, I think, the first one I read of his. And that's what made me read all of his other ones. And I was a big football fan and football player when I was a kid. And it's a book about football. And it's the plot is the boy... he's probably in, I don't know, 7th grade or something like that. And he wants to play quarterback for his team that year, but he had gotten really big. He had grown a lot. And so his coach ends up putting him on the offensive line. And he's really unhappy and he wants to quit because he had these dreams of being the quarterback of the team. And he has to be this lineman who, all he does is block and get beat up every day, playing that position. And so he wants to quit, but he has to learn how to be a good teammate, to play a role, to do what the team needs him to do. And he gets a lot of advice from his older brother who, again, this book is back in the 60s, who had been to Vietnam. And so his brother has to come along and tell him, hey, I know it seems tough, but trust me, I know about tough situations. And, as a soldier, my job is to take care of my teammates and to be reliable and to not quit on them. And so he kind of passes on these lessons to his younger brother. And of course, they end up having a successful season and all that. So again, just really good life lessons and good, um, again, not heavy-handed morals necessarily, but just good things for young boys to learn about, whether they're serious athletes or just casual fans of sports. Those were things that I grew up on and I really enjoyed. And so they're out there. These things have always been out there. Most of these books I have are from the 50s and 60s. And I know they might seem outdated for kids now, but, as parents and teachers, you can just explain, well, no, back then this is how the game was played, or this is what the leagues were like, or, you can kind of give a little history lesson with it. But the stories, the characters, and how they interact with their parents and their friends at school, and, what they do to hang out with each other, and like all that is totally relatable for all kids and especially boys. So if you are a parent or a teacher and you're a bit dismayed at where reading has gone, especially for young boys, I just encourage you. You just got to go find stuff that your boys will like, and it just takes one. Just find one book that they kind of devour, and they'll want to get more, and then you can keep feeding it to them. Now, I didn't just read sports books. That was mostly what I would say 80% of the time. That's what I was reading. But I have a variety of other things as well. So let me grab a couple of those. I would sometimes read novelizations of movies I really liked. So I have one from Star Wars, some other Star Wars adventure. Superman. I watched the original Superman Part 1 and 2 with Christopher Reeve, I don't know, 1,000 times when I was a kid. So I would read about Superman, not comic books. I could not care less about comic books when I was a kid. Like I wanted to read real stories, and so those were a couple that were based on movies that I had on my shelf. But then when you grow up in the 80s, there are a few staples that we all knew about, and we either all had copies of ourselves or we had read them for school or just for fun from the library. One of those was, of course, The Indian in the Cupboard. One of my only sort of female books. I did like some of the Beverly Cleary stuff. The Ramona books were usually kind of funny. And so those were one of my only non-male oriented books. If you grew up in the 80s, you would be very familiar with the Chocolate Fever book, as well as the cartoon that went with it. This book was so popular, I actually had 2 copies of it for some reason. I don't know why I have 2, but somehow I ended up with 2. Of course, the BFG. This book was introduced to me in 5th grade. And funny enough, my teacher was reading it. So we'd come in from recess and, to cool off or whatever, she'd read for 10 minutes or whatever. And some days she would have some of the students read. And because I was a good reader, she picked me to read one day. And it just so happened, I don't know if she did this to me just to see how I would react or if it was just the sad luck of the draw. But the day I was picked to read after recess, the BFG, to the whole class, is the chapter on whiz poppers. If you know the story of the BFG, you might know what a ridiculously funny chapter that is. And I was sitting up on a stool in front of all my classmates reading about whiz poppers. And I'm sure turning all different shades of red. But very funny book. I've read it a million times. And when I became an elementary teacher, I used to do the same thing where kids would come in from recess and I would read to them for a few minutes. And the BFG was one of those books I shared with the kids, and they, of course, loved it. Another book that was the same thing that was read to me when I was a kid in school, and then I read to my classmates as well, and I read it on my own a bunch of times, was The K. This book is getting pretty beaten up, but great story about friendship and about survival, and just a great kind of adventure story, kind of like the movie Castaway, and a little bit of history because it's during the war. So really great book. All boys should read that book, and it's hard to beat that. But then, books that weren't so famous, I'm sure these came from my dad's shelf, but I had this book called Secret Under the Sea about a boy who he lived on the coast and had a friend dolphin, and so they would swim around together and go diving, and one day there's these mysterious footprints on the ocean floor, and so they're like, what kind of monster is out there? And so again, boys going on adventures. Project Genius, this is like from this is actually, my mom's signature is in it, so this is from when she was a kid. 1962. So this is just about a kid who's coming up with these ideas to try to win his school science fair. One of my dad's books from when he was young, Radar Commando, is about a boy who helps Allied soldiers find a Nazi secret radar station. So again, boys doing interesting things, whether it's with kind of military stuff, whether it's with sports stuff, whether it's with being stranded on an island. Um, these are things that I liked as a kid, and I would assume your boys would still like those even today. I had, not many of these, but I always had a few around. Mystery books like the famous Bobbsey twins stories, the Haunted House Mystery, Mystery Cat and the Chocolate Trap. I don't know, about a cat that gets stolen in the neighborhood and the kids have to figure out who did it. Case of the Missing Dinosaur. I don't know why a dinosaur exists, but he's like their team mascot, and another team steals him to try to ruin their season. They got to figure out who did it. Adventure in the Haunted House. So, these kind of mystery, not necessarily spooky stories, but like where kids have to solve a case. Those were always really popular, and so I always had a few of those on hand. But then, of course, I had several of the staples along those lines. My copy of Where the Sidewalk Ends. It's completely beat up. I can't believe I still have the original cover on it, actually. But it's pretty torn up, and always fun. We always, as kids, knew those poems in that book. And then some other classics. I'm sure it came from my dad, but a version of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Jules Verne. Again, full novel. This isn't like a picture kids version. This is the real book, and I remember reading that in, I don't know, third or fourth grade probably. Again, for my dad, Shane Western, which became a very famous movie, of course. But again, it's the full novel. So there are some cowboy stories that I like, and then I always had a copy of, and it's really beat up, but as you can see by the binding, Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain. So kind of a pic with really great pictures in it, but full text as well, where Tom gets into a bunch of trouble, and of course, same version of Huck Finn. So I had a mixture of things, but again, those are very boy-oriented stories, from westerns to classic literature. That's what I liked, and that's what I read a lot about, and that's what made me into a lifelong reader and someone with a PhD in literature, I guess, is getting started early, and I still just devour 1 to 2 books a week, about all sorts of topics, and but this is where it started. So I'm always very saddened when I hear people's stories online where they can't get their boys to read, and their boys don't like school, and they're glued to screens all day or whatever. And that's something I'm just very fortunate to have lived through. Was an era where those things didn't really exist. We had television, but even then, there wasn't necessarily a lot on television. I grew up and there was still only basically 4 channels, the big 3, and then like your local PBS was about it, because we didn't even have cable for most of my childhood. So there wasn't a lot to do other than go outside and play, or if it was cold and snowy out and you didn't want to go out, like you stayed inside and you read books. And so that's what I did. So growing up during those eras was a lot different, and I'm very thankful for it. So get the screens out of your kids' hands. Do not hand them an iPad. Definitely don't hand them a phone. And one option is read the books with them. Either sit down with each other and have your son or daughter, doesn't matter, read one chapter, and then you read one chapter, then they read one chapter. Read back and forth to each other. That's what my dad and I used to do from time to time, especially if we were doing work around the house. I remember one summer we were painting a room in our little teeny tiny like apartment house or wherever we were living, and that's what we did. So he'd paint for a while, and I would read a chapter of one of my sports books, and then after whatever 15 minutes or something, we'd stop, and then I'd grab the paintbrush and I'd do the painting, and I'm like 9 years old or whatever. I'm doing the work and he's reading, and then we'd switch. And so that's what you can do. And while you're doing some chore, you could be reading while you're doing that chore. Take turns reading, or if you don't want to read out loud, have your son or daughter read one chapter one day, and then you get the book the next day and you read it, and then the next day they read the next chapter, and maybe at the end of the week you share what you've been learning or what you've been liking about that book. So having parents read alongside the kids is really, really useful, I would say. But then also, parents need to be reading on their own. I know parents are busy and they have other things to do. There's other chores and taking care of things, and you have your own job, of course. But the more your kids can see you with a physical book in your hand, not scrolling through Instagram, not even reading a book on your iPad, but reading a physical book, your kids will want to figure out, hey, what are you reading about? And and that's what happened in my household. And so, yes, I was very fortunate to be raised in a house with two very educated parents, who valued their own reading and who pushed me very hard in school to be a good student and be a good reader from a very early age. But also, again, I was a really good athlete too, and I liked all sorts of stuff. I liked movies, and um, I was always out doing crazy stuff with my friends, and all the things young boys used to do. And so it wasn't just that I was a bookworm nerd. I just sat around reading all day. Like, I did all sorts of stuff. Reading was just part of all of that stuff that I did. And um, I would go play my sport, and then I would read a book about a kid playing that sport, and then or I would read a book about that kid on that team, and then that week I'd have a game on my team. And so, like, I always saw these parallels with the people I was reading about, these characters in these great novels. So um, again, it can be done. I've kept all my books. Or at least tried to. I've moved a bunch of times in my 46 years, so I've perhaps lost a few along the way. But I'm glad I've kept a lot of these. And when I was an elementary teacher, I brought all these to school, and so maybe that's where some of them disappeared to. And I had them on a shelf in my room. I was like, here are my books. Read them. You can read these too. I want to share them with you. And so the kids got to have a glimpse into, again, whether it's Indian in the Cupboard or the K or the BFG or these kinds of books that were so popular when I was a kid. I got to share those with my students and give them some insight into what it was like when I was in their shoes as a 9, 10, 11, 12-year old, and and share what I was interested in. And often they got a kick out of it. Sometimes they didn't like it. They didn't always like the sports stuff, or they like their own things. I had kids in my classes who were starting to read the Harry Potter stuff. My nieces and nephews right now are going through those. So there's all sorts of things you can find, but we just got to try harder. We just got to find stuff that kids are interested in. There's sort of a debate about, well, is any reading good reading? After all, should we be having kids read trash? But then say, well, at least they're reading. It's like, well, we don't want to have them read trash. Like, we don't want to have them read things that are, I would say, immoral, or that are just not well written. That have not very good vocabulary. Um, don't follow good grammar, things like that. Like, yeah, we don't want to have them read that and think, well, anything's reading. Again, these are real novels. These are real biographies written by experts, actual authors. So, the content, the subject matter, as long as it's not something, again, inappropriate and immoral, I don't have a problem with it. Whatever the kid, if you're interested in science, yeah, let's get a bunch of science books. I went through a phase like many kids. I was very interested in some of the dinosaur stuff or animal stuff. And then for a long time, I was interested in astronomy. So I read all sorts of stuff on the planets and space and all this stuff. So whatever they're interested in, it doesn't matter as long as it's well written. Um, it doesn't have to be classic literature. It doesn't have to be, super scholarly stuff. It can be silly. Um, but anything is good to get their vocabulary working, to get them to see sentence structure, to get them to hear dialogue, to get them to hear and see description done well, to learn the structure of a plot, and like, why does this story work, but that story is not as good? Like, all that stuff is great. And the earlier you can start, the better. And so for me, it just happened to be sports, as well as a few other genres and topics. But, you know, we've got to find something. We've got to get kids away from being in front of a screen and away from playing video games for 8 hours straight. Um, Challenge their brain, improve their vocabulary. Books are also, like I said, with parents in the household, just great for generating dialogue, because you can talk about these stories and these lessons that they learn in the book and ask if the kid if they agree with it, or what would you have done in that situation if that were you. And like, again, this is what I did with my dad all the time, because a lot of this stuff probably came from him, sports stuff anyway. And so like those are the conversations we would have, and he would teach me about how sports were when he was a kid, and then we'd watch the new sports together, and or the new teams and the new players. So it's a great bonding experience in your household as well. So, as I said, I've just been reading a lot lately about the demise of reading among all children, but especially boys. And as a boy who liked reading, as well as a whole bunch of other adventurous things, it makes me really sad. And it's one of the reasons I became a teacher, was to try to help boys get more excited about literacy, and we've just got to do a better job of it. We can't take the shortcut and shove a phone in front of them and go, "Oh, here, play on this for a while I get some peace and quiet." We can't do that. So here's all these stacks of books that have nourished me for over 40 years, since when I was a kid in the 80s. And I encourage you to go out, find some books of your own, and develop those young readers, especially those young boys. Thanks for watching.